You know, I've sat across from thousands of people on that stage, and if there is one thing I have learned in all my years of doing this, it's that there are always two versions of the truth, and then there's what actually happened. Most people don't come to me because they want to change. They come to me because they want me to tell them they're right. They want a stamp of approval on their own personal version of reality so they can go back and point a finger at their spouse and say, see, even Dr. Phil thinks you're the problem. That was the case with David and Sarah. When I first looked at the files sitting on my desk, I saw a familiar pattern. David was the one who reached out to us. He was a successful architect, a man who built things to last, a man who prided himself on logic, structure, and order. In his initial emails and the pre-interview tapes, he painted a picture of a marriage that was crumbling not because of a lack of effort on his part, but because his wife, Sarah, was quote-unquote unstable. He used words like high conflict, irrational, and hysterical. He told my producers that he was at the end of his rope, that he was living with a woman he no longer recognized, and that he was worried about the environment they were creating for their two young children. On the surface, David looked like a man who was trying to save his family. But I've been doing this far too long to take anything at face value. I've learned that when someone is that eager to label their partner as the sole source of all the dysfunction, they're usually hiding the part they played in creating the mess. They want to talk about the reaction, but they never want to talk about the provocation. When Sarah walked into the studio for the first time, I didn't see the hysterical woman David had described. I saw a woman who looked exhausted. I saw a woman whose spirit had been eroded, bit by bit, until there was almost nothing left but a defensive shell. She sat on the edge of that chair, her shoulders up to her ears, eyes darting around like she was waiting for a trap to spring. David, on the other hand, sat back with his legs crossed, looking calm, collected, and ready to present his case. He looked like a man who had already won. He started talking before I even finished my introduction. He told me about the screaming matches, the way Sarah would break down in tears over the smallest things, and how she had become increasingly paranoid about his whereabouts. He had a spreadsheet of her outbursts. He had recorded her voice during her worst moments. He was presenting a dossier of her failures as if he were an attorney in a courtroom. And as I sat there listening to him, I noticed something. Every time he spoke, he looked at me, not at her. He was performing, he was building a narrative, he was telling me what she did, but he wasn't saying a word about what he did to get her there. He forgot that you don't get a fire without a spark, and I was determined to find out who was holding the match. To understand where they were, I had to look at where they started. They had been married for 12 years. In the beginning, they were the it couple. Sarah was an artist, full of life and spontaneity, and David was the anchor she thought she needed. She told me that back then, his need for control felt like protection. She thought he was taking care of her. But as the years went on, that protection started to feel more like a cage. It started with small things. He would suggest how she should dress for certain events so she wouldn't embarrass him. He would offer advice on her career until she eventually gave up her studio because he convinced her it wasn't financially viable. He slowly began to isolate her from her friends, always under the guise of wanting more quality time together. By the time they had their first child, Sarah had effectively disappeared. She wasn't an artist anymore. She was a stay-at-home mother who had to ask for permission to buy groceries. This is a pattern I see all the time, what I call the slow erosion of the self. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a series of small concessions that eventually lead to a total loss of identity. David didn't see it as control, he saw it as leadership. He thought he was the one keeping the ship afloat while Sarah was drifting out to sea. But the truth was, he was the one poking holes in the bottom of the boat and then complaining that she was getting everyone wet when she tried to bail the water out. As we delve deeper into their history during our private sessions before the cameras even rolled, The escalation of their conflict became clear. Sarah started pushing back, as anyone would when they feel like they're being erased. But her pushback wasn't calculated like David's control was. It was desperate. It was messy. She started shouting because she felt she wasn't being heard. She started checking his phone because his behavior had become so secretive and cold that she was certain he was hiding something, and he was. He was hiding his contempt. David had developed a way of speaking to her that was so condescending, so dismissive, that it was designed to trigger a reaction. He would use a calm, monotone voice to say the most hurtful things imaginable, and then when she finally exploded in frustration, he would point at her and say, "See, you're the one with the problem. I'm just sitting here trying to talk to you." This is a classic tactic. It's called gaslighting, though people throw that word around a lot these days without really knowing what it means. In this case, it was the literal definition. He was systematically undermining her perception of reality to maintain his own sense of power. He wanted her to believe she was crazy so that he never had to be responsible for his own coldness, his own emotional absence, or his own arrogance. The tension between them had reached a boiling point by the time they got to the show. The week before their flight to Los Angeles, there had been an incident that David kept bringing up as proof of her instability. He claimed she had attacked him. When I pushed for details, it turned out that he had stood in the doorway of their bedroom, refusing to let her leave the room while he lectured her on her failures as a wife. He had used his physical presence to intimidate her, and when she tried to push past him to get away, he grabbed her arms and held her there until she started screaming for help. To David, the story was about her screaming and attacking his chest to get away. To me, the story was about a man who thought he had the right to physically restrain his wife because she didn't want to listen to his verbal abuse anymore. He was so blinded by his own need to be right that he couldn't see the cruelty in his actions. He truly believed he was the victim of her craziness. He didn't understand that her craziness was actually a survival mechanism. When you are pushed into a corner long enough, you eventually start to bite. And David was very good at pushing her into corners while making it look to the outside world like he was just trying to give her a hug. I looked at Sarah and asked her, "Do you feel like you're losing your mind?" She didn't even hesitate. Tears started streaming down her face, and she just nodded. She told me she didn't know who she was anymore. She didn't trust her own memories. She would remember him saying something cruel, and he would tell her he never said it, or that she had misinterpreted it because of her condition. He had even suggested she see a psychiatrist to get on medication for a mood disorder that she didn't have. He was trying to medicate the reaction instead of fixing the cause. This is what I mean when I say they never tell you what they did. David gave me a list of her symptoms, but he didn't give me a list of his behaviors. He didn't tell me about the silent treatment that lasted for days. He didn't tell me about the way he would scoff at her paintings until she threw them in the trash. He didn't tell me that he had total control over every bank account and that she had to show him receipts for every cent she spent. He presented the result of a broken woman and tried to claim she came that way out of the box. But nobody comes out of the box like that. Life does that to you. Partners do that to you. And my job was to strip away the narrative David had built and show him the mirror he had been avoiding for over a decade. I sat there in the silence of my dressing room before we went back out under the lights, thinking about that dossier David had compiled. It's a strange thing, isn't it? To live with someone you supposedly love and yet spend your time gathering evidence against them like you're building a federal case. That told me more about David than any of his spreadsheets ever could. It told me he wasn't looking for a partner, he was looking for a defendant. He wanted to be the judge, the jury, and the executioner in his own home. When we walked back out onto that stage, I decided it was time to change the rhythm of the conversation. I didn't want to hear another word about Sarah's episodes. I wanted to talk about the climate David was creating in that house. You see, you can't judge a person's reaction without looking at the environment they're reacting to. If you put a person in a room, turn up the heat to 110 degrees, and take away the water, you can't act surprised when they start sweating and gasping for air. David was the one turning the thermostat up, and then he was calling the doctor because his wife looked flushed. I turned to David and I asked him a very simple question. I said, David, when you record your wife during her worst moments, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish in that moment? He looked at me, blinked a few times, and said he wanted proof because she would deny saying things later. I leaned in and asked him, but does it help? Does playing a recording of her crying or screaming back to her the next day make her feel heard? Does it make her feel loved? Does it move the needle toward a resolution? He didn't have an answer for that because the truth was he didn't care about resolution. He cared about being right. He wanted to win the argument, even if it meant losing his wife. I've seen this 1,000 times. It's a form of emotional currency. He was stockpiling her failures so he could spend them whenever he felt his control was being challenged. It was a way to keep her in a perpetual state of one-down position. If she's always the crazy one, then he never has to look at his own coldness. He never has to address the fact that he hasn't looked her in the eye or given her a genuine compliment in 3 years. Then we got to the kids. This is where the rubber really meets the road for me. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, both under the age of 10. Sarah started talking about how the children were beginning to treat her. She described how her 8-year-old son had started talking back to her in the exact same condescending tone that David used. When she would try to discipline him, the boy would roll his eyes and say, "Dad says you're just being dramatic again." My heart broke for that woman in that moment, but more than that, I felt a deep sense of urgency for those kids. Children are like sponges. They don't just hear what you say, they soak up the way you treat people. David was teaching his son that women's emotions are something to be mocked and dismissed. He was teaching his daughter that her voice didn't matter and that love looks like control. I looked at David and I told him, you are teaching your son how to be a bully and your daughter how to be a victim. Is that the legacy you want to leave? For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance in his eyes. It was a tiny crack in the armor, but it was there. He tried to defend himself, saying he always spoke highly of their mother, but I stopped him right there. I told him, don't tell me what you say to them, tell me what they see. They see you dismiss her. They see you ignore her. They see you treat her like an inconvenience rather than a partner. They are learning that dad is the boss and mom is the problem. We moved into the confrontation phase of the session, and this is where I usually have to get real aggressive with people like David. I played back one of the recordings he had brought in. It was a 5-minute clip of Sarah sobbing, sounding absolutely broken, while David's voice remained calm, steady, and incredibly cruel. He was saying things like, "Are you done yet? Because this is pathetic. The kids are going to see you like this and realize why I have to do everything around here." Listening to it in the cold light of day, in front of an audience, stripped away the logic David thought he was using. It didn't sound like a man trying to help his wife. It sounded like a man who was enjoying the power he had over her. I asked the audience, how many of you hear a hysterical woman, and how many of you hear a woman who is being bullied? The response was overwhelming. Sarah started to sob again, but this time they weren't the tears of a crazy person. They were the tears of someone who was finally being seen, someone who finally had a witness to the invisible war she had been fighting in her own living room for a decade. I turned back to David and I didn't let him off the hook. I told him, you think you're the hero of this story. You think you're the long-suffering husband putting up with a difficult wife. But from where I'm sitting, you're a saboteur. You are sabotaging her mental health so you can maintain the upper hand. That's not a marriage, David. That's a hostage situation. I asked him if he even liked his wife, not if he loved her, because people use the word love to justify all kinds of abuse. I asked him if he liked her, if he respected her. He sat in silence for a long beat. The perfect facade was starting to crumble. He started to realize that the proof he had brought to shame her had actually exposed him. He had spent months preparing to put her on trial, and he was the one who ended up in the hot seat. This is the moment of truth in any intervention. This is where the person has to decide. Am I going to lean into the lie to protect my ego, or am I going to admit that I've been wrong and start the hard work of changing? I looked at Sarah and I asked her what she needed. She didn't say she needed him to be nicer. She didn't say she needed more money or a vacation. She looked him right in the eye, her voice shaking, and said, I need you to tell the truth, just once. I need you to admit that you've been hurting me on purpose. The room went dead quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. David looked down at his hands. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable silence. He wasn't the architect in that moment. He wasn't the man with the spreadsheets. He was just a man who had built a house of cards and watched it blow over. I told him, David, the truth will set you free, but first, it's going to make you miserable. You have spent years gaslighting this woman into believing she is the source of all the toxicity in your home. You have used your intellect as a weapon. You have used your children as pawns. And if you don't stop right now, you're going to lose them all, not because she's unstable, but because you've pushed her so far away that she'll eventually realize she's better off alone than with a man who makes her feel invisible. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was looking for an escape hatch, a way to turn it back on her, but I wouldn't give it to him. Every time he started a sentence with "but she," I stopped him. I told him, we aren't talking about her right now. We are talking about you. We are talking about the man who chooses to record his wife's pain instead of comforting her. We are talking about the man who thinks calm is the same thing as kind. It's not. You can be the calmest person in the world and still be the most abusive. In fact, that cold, calculated calmness is often more damaging than a heated argument because there's no passion in it. There's only contempt. And contempt is the kiss of death for any relationship. If you have contempt for your partner, you have already decided they are beneath you. And if they are beneath you, you will never treat them with the dignity they deserve. I watched David as he sat there, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point on the floor. I knew what was happening in his head. He was looking for the exit. He was looking for a way to rewrite the script so he could still be the good guy. People like David, they have a very curated image of themselves. They believe they are logical, they believe they are the adult in the room, and they use that belief as a shield against any kind of accountability. I told him, David, you can sit there and tell yourself that you're just the calm, rational husband dealing with a difficult wife, but that's a lie. You're not being rational, you're being cold. And there is a huge difference between being calm and being kind. You are using your calmness as a weapon. You are using it to make her look crazy so you don't have to look at yourself. It's a form of emotional surgery where you're cutting her heart out without using any anesthesia, and then you're complaining about the blood on your shoes. I asked him, how do you think it feels to live with someone who treats you like a project instead of a person? How does it feel to have every word you say recorded and used against you? That's not a home, that's an interrogation room. Sarah was sitting next to him, and for the first time in the entire session, she wasn't looking at him with fear or desperation. She was looking at him with a kind of sad clarity. She told me, Doctor, Phil, I spent years thinking if I just tried harder, if I just stayed calmer, if I just kept the house cleaner or was a better mother, he would finally see me. I thought the problem was me. I really believed him when he said I was the one who was broken. This is the part of the story that most people never get to see. This is the what they did part. David never told anyone about the way he would walk into a room and just ignore her for hours. He never told anyone about the way he would roll his eyes when she talked about her dreams. He never told anyone about the way he used money to keep her trapped. He only told the part where she eventually lost her temper and started shouting. He showed everyone the explosion, but he never showed them the fuse he'd been lighting for 10 years. I turned to Sarah and I said, "You aren't crazy. You are reacting to an impossible situation. You've been living in a psychological pressure cooker, and of course, you're going to boil over. The fact that you're still standing at all is a testament to your strength, not your instability." But I didn't want to just give her a pass either. I had to be tough with her too, because she had allowed this to happen. I told her, "You've been a co-conspirator in your own disappearance. You've been handing him the matches. You've been accepting his version of the truth because it was easier than facing the fact that the man you loved was actually your biggest critic. You have to decide today if you're going to keep playing the role of the unstable wife or if you're going to take your power back. And taking your power back doesn't mean winning an argument with him. It means realizing you don't need his permission to exist. It means realizing that his opinion of you is none of your business. This is where the real work begins. I've seen so many couples come on this stage and think that just talking about it for an hour is going to fix a decade of damage. It doesn't work that way. You can't talk your way out of a problem you behaved your way into. You have to behave your way out of it. And for David, that meant a radical shift in how he viewed his wife and his role as a husband. I asked David if he was willing to go into our resource center and work with a professional who understands the dynamics of emotional abuse and control. I told him, "You need to understand why you have this pathological need to be superior. You need to understand why you are so afraid of a woman who actually has a voice." Because that's what this is really about. It's about fear. You're afraid that if she's healthy, if she's strong, and if she's independent, she won't need you anymore. So you keep her small to keep her around. That's not love, David. That's ownership. And you don't own her. You're lucky to even be in the same room as her after the way you've treated her. He finally looked up at me, and I saw a tear roll down his cheek. It was the first sign of genuine emotion I'd seen from him all day. He said, "I didn't realize I was doing it. I thought I was helping. I thought I was the one holding everything together." I told him, "Well, you thought wrong. You were the one pulling it apart. And now you have to decide if you're going to be the man who fixes it or the man who walks away and does the same thing to the next woman he meets." We spent the next hour breaking down the specific behaviors that had to stop immediately. No more recordings. No more spreadsheets of failure. No more using the children as leverage. I told them both that they were on probation in their own lives. They needed to live apart for a while so Sarah could find her footing and David could find his soul. You can't heal in the same environment that made you sick. They needed space to breathe. They needed space to see who they were without the constant friction of their toxic dance. Sarah looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted off her chest. David looked terrified. He was losing his control. And for a man like him, that's the scariest thing in the world. But I told him, losing control is the best thing that ever happened to you. Because the control you thought you had was an illusion. It was a prison you built for yourself just as much as it was for her. You've been a warden instead of a partner, and that's a lonely way to live. As we were wrapping up the session, I looked at the audience and I said, this isn't just about David and Sarah. This is about anyone who is sitting at home right now, feeling like they're going crazy because their partner is telling them they're the problem. If you are in a relationship where you feel like you have to record conversations to prove what was said, or if you feel like you're constantly being diagnosed by someone who isn't a doctor, you are being emotionally abused. It's that simple. Don't wait for them to admit it, because they might never do it. You have to trust your own eyes and your own ears. You have to believe in your own reality. David and Sarah's story didn't end on that stage. It was just the beginning of a very long and very painful road. But for the first time in 12 years, they were both walking on the same ground. They were both looking at the same truth. And that's the only place where healing can actually start. You can't build a life on a foundation of lies and manipulation. You have to tear it all down to the studs and start over. And sometimes you find out that the house isn't worth saving. Sometimes you find out that the best thing you can do for everyone involved is to walk away and build something new on your own. I told them I was going to provide them with the best help available, but they had to be willing to do the work. I told David, if I find out you're back to your old tricks, if I find out you've tried to gaslight her one more time, we're done. I'm not interested in helping someone who just wants to learn how to be a better manipulator. I'm only interested in helping people who want to be better human beings. He nodded, and he actually reached out and took Sarah's hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't squeeze back either. She was waiting, she was watching, she was finally, for the first time, protecting herself. And that was the biggest victory of the day. She didn't need me to save her. She just needed me to show her that she was worth saving. She needed someone to stand up to the bully and say, I see what you're doing, and it stops now. That's what we do here. We turn the lights on so the monsters have nowhere to hide. And once the lights are on, you can never really go back to the dark. You can try to close your eyes, but you'll always know what's there. When the camera stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, that's when the real test began. I've seen it happen 1,000 times. The stage high wears off, the adrenaline subsides, and the reality of what just happened starts to sink in. On that stage, under the gaze of an audience and a man who isn't afraid to call you out on your garbage, it's easy to nod and say you'll change. But the car ride home is where the old ghosts start whispering again. I watched David and Sarah walk off that stage, and I could see the wheels turning in David's head. He was already looking for a way to minimize the damage to his ego. He was already thinking about how he could explain this away to his friends and his family. He was probably already drafting a mental script of how I misunderstood him or how the editing would make him look like a villain. That's the thing about people who use control as a survival strategy. They don't give it up without a fight. They treat their psychological defenses like a fortress, and I had just blown a hole in the front gate. I made sure my producers stayed in close contact with them during those first few weeks after the show. We didn't just send them home with a good luck and a handshake. We set them up with top-tier individual therapists in their hometown, because you can't fix a marriage like that in a joint session, not at first. You have to fix the individuals before they can even hope to be part of a healthy couple. Sarah needed to reconstruct her shattered sense of self. She needed a professional to tell her over and over again that her memories were real, that her feelings were valid, and that she wasn't the crazy person David had spent years convincing her she was. David, on the other hand, needed someone to hold a mirror up to his face every single day. He needed to be challenged on his need for dominance. He needed to dig into his own history, his own father's coldness, his own childhood fears of inadequacy, to understand why he felt the need to keep his wife in a state of emotional paralysis just so he could feel powerful. The feedback I got from their therapists was telling. In the beginning, David was a model patient, or so he thought. He would show up on time, use all the right psychological buzzwords, and try to charm the therapist into agreeing with his logical framework. He was still trying to win therapy. He treated his sessions like a corporate performance review, but his therapist was seasoned. She didn't bite. She kept bringing him back to his behavior, not his explanations. She kept asking him, "Why do you feel the need to record your wife? What does that give you?" It took months of digging before he finally broke down and admitted the truth. He was terrified. He was terrified that if Sarah ever realized how much better she was than him, she'd leave him in a heartbeat. He didn't think he was enough just as he was, so he had to make her less than to keep the scales balanced. That is the ugly, pathetic secret behind most emotional abusers. It's not about strength. It's about a profound, deep-seated weakness. They don't pull themselves up, they just push everyone else down so they look taller by comparison. Sarah's journey was different. It was like watching a flower grow through a crack in the sidewalk. She started small. She went back to a local art class. She started seeing her old friends again. The ones David had suggested were bad influences. She realized that the world didn't end when she went out for coffee without asking permission. But the trauma of gaslighting doesn't just vanish. She told her therapist that she would still find herself double-checking her own thoughts, wondering if she was remembering it wrong even when she knew she wasn't. She had to learn to trust her own brain again. That's the most insidious thing about what David did. He didn't just hurt her. He stole her confidence in her own reality. He made her a stranger to herself. Healing from that is a long, slow process of reclaiming your own mind, one thought at a time. About 3 months after the show, something happened that really showed me where they were. David had a bad day at work, and he came home and tried to start the old cycle. He made a snide comment about the house being messy, a classic setup for a fight. In the past, Sarah would have apologized, started cleaning frantically, or ended up in tears, which would have given David the proof he needed that she was unstable. But this time, she did something different. She looked at him, totally calm, and said, "David, I'm not doing this with you today. If you're unhappy with the house, you're welcome to clean it, or you can go for a walk until you're ready to speak to me with respect. I'm going to my studio." And then she just walked away. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She just set a boundary and enforced it. David was stunned. The old hooks didn't work anymore. He had no fish on the line. He sat in that living room all alone with his own bad mood. And for the first time, he had nowhere to put it. He had to sit with it himself. That was a turning point. When you stop reacting to a manipulator, you take away their power. You change the dance. David realized that the old way wasn't going to work anymore because Sarah wasn't the same woman she was when they stepped onto that stage in Los Angeles. She had found her no, and once a woman like that finds her no, you can never truly own her again. He had a choice. He could either grow up and meet her where she was, or he could lose her forever. To his credit, and I don't give credit easily, David chose to stay in the work. He didn't do it perfectly. He slipped up. He had moments where the old controlling version of himself tried to take the wheel, but he started catching himself. He started apologizing, real apologies, not the "I'm sorry you feel that way" garbage, but genuine admissions of "I was trying to control you just now, and I'm sorry." The impact on the children was the most profound part of the outcome. Their son, who had been mimicking David's condescending tone, started to see a different model of manhood. He saw a father who could admit he was wrong. He saw a mother who stood up for herself without losing her cool. The tension in the house began to dissipate. Kids are like barometers for the emotional pressure in a home, and the storm was finally moving out. They started doing family therapy, focusing on communication and emotional intelligence. The son learned that it's okay to have feelings and that those feelings don't make you dramatic or weak. The daughter learned that she has a voice and that she doesn't have to shrink herself to make a man feel big. That's the real win in my book. We didn't just save a marriage, and to be honest, I wasn't sure it should be saved at first. We saved the next generation from repeating the same toxic patterns. I continued to monitor them for a year. They didn't have a fairy tale ending where everything was perfect and they walked off into the sunset. Marriage isn't a movie, it's a marathon. They had hard months. They had sessions where they both wanted to give up, but they stayed in the process. Sarah eventually moved back into the house, but on her own terms. She kept her separate studio. She kept her separate bank account. She maintained her independence because she knew that for her, independence was the only way to stay healthy. David had to learn to love a woman he couldn't control, and he found out that a woman you don't control is a whole lot more interesting and vibrant than a woman who is just a shadow of yourself. He found out that when you stop being a warden, you actually get to have a friend. The reason I wanted to tell this story is because there are so many Davids and Sarahs out there. There are so many people who walk through life thinking that as long as they aren't hitting someone, they aren't being abusive. But emotional and psychological control is a slow-acting poison. It's the what they did that they never want to talk about. They want to talk about the hysterical wife, but they never want to talk about the man who spent a decade making her that way. They want to talk about the nagging husband, but they never want to talk about the woman who uses silence as a weapon. If you are the person who is always being told you're the problem, I want you to take a long, hard look at the person telling you that. Are they bringing out the best in you, or are they systematically dismantling you so you're easier to manage? You have to be willing to see the truth, even if it hurts, because you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. And once you acknowledge it, you have a responsibility to yourself and your children to change it. You don't have to live in the dark. You don't have to be a ghost in your own home. You can stand up, you can speak up, and you can take your life back. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but I promise you, it is worth it. You are worth it.